On the day World War I began, a French aviator named Roland Garros had found himself in the awkward position of being stranded in Berlin. Garros had been one of the more famous names from the early days of flying. After seeing the Brazilian pioneer Santos Dumont demonstrate his 14 bis outside of Paris, Garros had abandoned his studies in classical music and taken up flying. By 1911, he'd set the world's altitude record, been the first man to fly across the Mediterranean, and then had spent the next 3 years performing exhibition flights that had taken him all over the European continent and even to America. And so, in August 1914, while German troops were pouring into Belgium, the Frenchman sat under house arrest in his Berlin hotel room. Faced with the prospect of internment, Garros had simply climbed out a bathroom window in the middle of the night and walked to the exhibition field where his airplane sat. After stowing a couple of gasoline cans on board, he'd taken off into the darkness and flown himself home. Back in Paris, Garros immediately reported for service and was attached to Escadrille MS No. 23, a squadron whose personnel included many of France's most famous pre-war flyers. Garros was a welcome addition to the group. MS No. 23 followed the French system of designating its squadrons, the MS standing for Marine Salner, the type of aircraft the group flew. Escadrille 23 flew the Type N, a single-seat monoplane powered by an 80-horsepower Gnome rotary engine. Although the plane was one of the best-performing machines at the time, it was hampered by its lack of armament. The French had begun experimenting with their Nieuport biplanes, mounting a Lewis gun on the top wing to fire over the arc of the propeller. This arrangement did show some promise, but it also presented its own set of problems. It would be both difficult to aim and even harder to reload in flight. With the monoplane Garros flew, there was no way to mount a gun, and he'd grown increasingly frustrated with his inability to fire at the Germans he was encountering over the front. Time after time, he'd flown up directly behind the unarmed enemy two-seaters and could only sit and watch through the seemingly invisible disc of his propeller. The idea occurred to Garros that if a machine gun were fired directly through the spinning propeller, most of the bullets would miss it, but not all of them, and the propeller would ultimately be shot away. Could it be reinforced in some way to withstand those bullets that would inevitably strike it? Garros took his idea to the aircraft designer Robert Salner, and in March of 1915 returned to his escadrille with a brand new Type N machine boasting a pair of important modifications. One of these modifications was a Hotchkiss machine gun, mounted directly in front of the pilot. The other was a pair of steel deflection wedges bolted to the section of the propeller where the bullets would strike. In tests on the ground, the idea had basically worked. The propeller remained intact, but they quickly realized that the unpredictable nature of the ricocheting bullets would be an ongoing concern. It was on April Fool's Day when Garros finally got to test his new weapon in battle. He'd caught up with a flight of 4 Albatross two-seaters above the French lines, and had quickly maneuvered himself into position on the tail of the rearmost machine. One can only imagine the astonishment of the German observer's face when a burst of machine gun fire blossomed from behind the spinning arc of the Frenchman's propeller and slammed into the Albatross, killing the pilot and leaving the machine to careen towards the ground below. Garros quickly latched onto the tail of a second ship, which after receiving a short burst from his gun, caught fire and fell earthwards, incinerating its horrified crew. The surviving 2 German planes raced for home, their crews pale and unnerved over what they'd just witnessed. Over the next 18 days, Garros destroyed 3 more German airplanes. The psychological effect that this lone French monoplane had on the enemy flyers at the front was immense. German crews were terrified with the prospect of encountering this new weapon and began fleeing at the sight of any Allied single-seater. Garros, already somewhat of a household name in his country, was lauded in all the papers, declaring him an ace. Indeed, following the example set by Roland Garros, the feat of downing 5 enemy airplanes would forever after bestow upon a flyer the status of ace. On the German side of the lines, there was much speculation about this new secret weapon the German air crews were suddenly facing. The secret was revealed on April 19th, when Garros was forced to land behind the lines with a failed engine. He'd been sent to bomb the railroad siding at Courtrai when his motor had quit, and once on the ground had been unable to burn his machine before being taken captive. And so the Germans now knew how their airplanes were being shot down, and this knowledge would lead to the next great technological advance in aerial combat. 2.5 years later, when Roland Garros was to finally escape from a German prison camp and rejoin the fighting, it was to a very different world he returned, due in no small part to events he himself had set in motion.